see that. If anybody can't see that, make themselves known. I'm hoping this has done what it needs to do. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It is Neurodiversity Celebration Week. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to celebrate neurodiversity with you guys. And in particular, thinking about how that applies to diagnostic assessments. And then sort of more broader discussion about how to decide what is a good assessment, particularly if you're looking at different clinics and different assessment providers. There's lots of us out there. So I'm really keen to clue parents up, I guess, as to what to look for. So plans for this evening. I hope you're all, relaxed where you are, glass of wine in hand. Please feel free to sit back, relax and listen. We're going to start just by me introducing myself, and then we're going to talk about more generally what is neurodiversity. I'm going to have a rant about the diagnostic criteria and how it's the opposite of neuroaffirming. Then we're going to have a chat through what makes a good neuroaffirming diagnostic assessment. Then think about the benefits of why it would be helpful to pursue a diagnostic assessment. And then, as I said, hopefully leave lots of time at the end for questions. We're due to hang out together for an hour, but if we overrun, if you've got more questions, I'm more than happy to stay on for a bit longer. So just to say hi, I am Liz. I am a clinical psychologist, and I am, I guess, the clinic director of Every Mind Child Psychology. It was born out of my dream to actually create a service for neurodivergent young people that actually is for them and about them and works for them, because not many of those were around when I started up in 2018. So there's a picture of us in the middle. This is the team. We are growing. We are a team of clinical psychologists, assistant psychologists. I've got an occupational therapist who comes in to help, and speech and language therapy as well. So it's a lovely team. And I'm very lucky to have some very brilliant, highly skilled clinicians in our team. This is Ed on the left-hand side, Ed Sheeran. So he is our clinic pet. We also have some guinea pigs who are currently on their still on their winter holidays. To be honest, it's getting a bit cold, so they're home with me. But we have the pets that the kids can enjoy at the clinic. And then on the right is our waiting room, which is at the minute I would say rather too jam-packed with toys. We're having a cull, but I just can't help it. I'm addicted to Amazon. So let's start off by talking about what actually does neurodiversity mean. And I'm aware that there's lots of expertise online tonight, but just to kind of start by thinking about, look, we've all got different brains, so there is diversity in our brains. It makes absolute sense, doesn't it? It's not a one model, one size fits all. We're not robots. So neurodiversity represents that diversity, that all of our brains work in a different way, and there is huge value in having brains that see the world in unique and different ways. It adds something to our society, it adds something to our world to have brains that work in different ways. And this is very different to the traditional medical model that sees either normal or disordered. So if you were in any way different from the normal, you would be classed as disordered. Now we know that's not the case, and we'll carry on talking about that this evening. But just keep in mind, neurodiversity represents that diversity. And I guess neurodiversity is that umbrella term. And underneath that, we have your neurodivergent people and your neurotypical people. I am not a fan of either of those phrases, quite frankly, because neurodivergent feels quite negative. You have diverged from the normal, from the typical. And so it is still categorizing people in different ways. But for the point of this evening, if I use the word neurodivergent, it means autism, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia. So it's a brain that works different to I would say the sort of typical, the majority perhaps. But as I said, it's not a great term. It's just something that we are coining and using. I'm sorry, I'm just going to check the chat so I can see someone's mentioned. Sorry, Jordan. Oh, yes. Yes, there would be a recording, of course, Hannah. Yes, it's being recorded. This bit, I will turn off the recording probably for the Q&As later, just so that you feel a bit more relaxed having a discussion. So this here, these two trees represent what we're talking about here in terms of neurodiversity. So we have two trees, they're equally brilliant, but they have different environments, they work in different ways. And that represents neurodiversity. So, you know, the diversity between these trees, the way they work and what they give to the world actually adds value. They're both beautiful trees, but they do need very different environments to be able to cultivate, to grow, to thrive. One of them is enjoying this tropical peach. I would say this is a very AI'd image. I'm not quite sure it's growing there. The other one looks like it's perhaps enjoying more of a British climate in a meadow. And this represents a neurodivergent brain. It's different, it works in different ways, but it needs to thrive in the right environment with the right adaptations. And so this is the approach that we need to take when we're thinking about neuroaffirming and neuroaffirming practice. It's respecting the fact that different brains work in different ways and that we need to provide those adaptations and those environments in order to thrive. It's not seeing those brains as disordered. Neither one of those trees is disordered. It doesn't need to be fixed. It's not broken. We should respect, you know, their strengths and their abilities as they are. Sorry, computer's decided to die. Why aren't you checking? So just, this is a very quick, in a nutshell, I'm going to go into it a little bit more, autism and ADHD, because that's what we're talking about this evening. Autism essentially is differences in social communication, preference for predictability and sameness, social interaction differences, and sensory differences. And you'll notice I've been, you know, excuse me, sorry, I put my words back in. It was deliberate that I used the word difference, and I will go into that a little bit more, because when you're embracing a neuroaffirming approach, you're not seeing differences as something negative. It's not a deficit. It's not something that needs to be fixed. ADHD differences include differences in attention regulation. So we're not talking about disordered attention, even though attention deficit hyperactivity disorder makes you think there is. We don't have a deficit in attention in an ADHD brain. It is a difference in attention regulation. You see impulsivity, you see hyperactivity or restlessness. So this is an internal restlessness, not necessarily an external hyperactivity, and associated executive function differences. And whilst I won't go into this in lots of depth, executive function differences are the key abilities that you need to organize yourself, to time manage, to prioritize. Essentially, it's like that organizing system in your brain is different in an ADHD. So as I've said, we see autism and ADHD, it's a neurodivergence, so it's a divergence from a neurotypical brain, but that brings a natural variation and many strengths. So as a neuroaffirming approach, a neurodiversity affirming approach would see autism and ADHD as differences. They're not deficits. This is not something that needs to be fixed. So a diagnostic assessment that is truly neuroaffirming is one that looks at understanding and discovering how a brain works and respecting how a brain works. It in no way tries to identify a deficit or tries to fix it. And in doing so, that enables a child to be able to thrive as they are. So we're not at a starting point in a diagnostic assessment where you're saying this child has all of these difficulties and they need to be fixed. A neuroaffirming diagnostic assessment would take an approach that says, we're trying to help this young person to thrive as they are, because they are perfect as they are. And that creates understanding, it creates adaptations within an environment, it places that individual, that child, right at the center of it. So why might you pursue a diagnostic assessment? Well, first and foremost, it might be because you or the child want to understand how their brain works. The brain is an amazing thing. Let's try and understand a little bit more about their unique perspective on the world, how they process information, how they exist, I guess, within the world. And in doing so, it reduces shame and it reduces self-blame, because for many neurodivergent people, without that understanding, the tendency is to turn the fault and blame on themselves. And believe me, that can be really, really damaging. It could be that the child is struggling, but the reasons aren't really clear. So it might be that they are struggling with anxiety, particularly at school, or struggling with different aspects of their world, and there isn't a narrative, there isn't an understanding as to why. And, you know, it could have said that that child might be turning the blame internally on themselves. It might be that support at school is difficult to access. It shouldn't be. It should be needs driven. So it should be that schools are seeing needs and putting in support accordingly. But it is still the case in some places where a diagnosis is going to open some doors. It shouldn't be. That's not how it should be. But sometimes it does. It could be that the child is actually feeling quite confused about themselves. You know, why am I different? Why is my brain working like this? Why am I finding these environments or these situations so difficult? Perhaps they're asking for an assessment. They're asking to discover what's going on with their brain. It might be that parents want that deeper understanding. Perhaps, you know, as parents, your instincts are right. You know, if something feels different or something's not working, and you want to seek a reason for that or an understanding so that you can respond accordingly, so that you could support in a neuroaffirming way with all the information at your disposal. Yeah, and the young person is asking questions about themselves. There's lots of, you know, certainly on TikTok and various social media platforms, there are many videos out there, lots of bloggers talking about autism and ADHD. People are self-discovering their neurodivergence and creating videos and content about it. That has positives and negatives, but for young people who are wanting to, you know, get some questions answered perhaps about their experience, then it might be they've watched one of those videos and they come to you going, this sounds like me, like maybe I want to pursue this and understand my brain a little bit. And these are some quotes that that you know, I've heard from young people at our clinic where we've discovered neurodivergence. And for many people, young people, you know, a diagnosis is life-changing. A discovery of their neurodivergence is life-changing. So, you know, these are quotes. I knew I wasn't strange. I knew that my brain just worked differently. I was like my brother and my dad. In this case, they've got a diagnosis. I know that it's not my fault when I become overwhelmed. Somebody else said it was life-changing. It confirmed what I always suspected. It was relief to know that I'm not broken. I now know who I am and I'm beginning to accept myself. And of course, that is part of the process. It's not just the discovery or the diagnosis. It's actually then, so what next? Let's try and understand what that means for me. Let's understand more about how my brain works, get adaptations in place afterwards. We'll talk about this. There's lots of research coming out from the autistic community in particular that identifies that when a young person gets a diagnosis and is able to associate positively with that diagnosis, it creates a positive neuroaffirming identity. And that is a real positive when it comes to protecting against mental health. It creates a community, you know, it creates an access to a community of other like-minded young people once the discovery of neurodivergence has been made, which can be so relieving and reassuring for so many young people. It's incredible. So, you know, I am pro-diagnosis, but that's because I can see the huge benefits for a young person and their identity. And that is backed up by research, but also the lived experience of young people and autistic adults and ADHD adults who actually have really felt the benefits of that identification. It's made a real difference in their life. But as we will come on to talk about, how that identification, how that diagnosis is made really makes the difference. When it's neuroaffirming, you're already on the path to a more positive self-identity. When it's deficits driven and really focused on what a child can't do in very medicalized language, that can have a lasting impact. So I'm about to get on my soapbox, just everybody get ready, about the DSM. So the DSM is a diagnostic criteria, the diagnostic manual actually, that we use here in the UK to make diagnoses. I mean, you can get a diagnosis of anything according to the DSM. It sets out a criteria of what we're looking for in order to make a diagnosis. That aligns with something called the NICE guidelines. If people aren't familiar with it, NICE guidelines are clinical recommendations, guidance for how you set about making a diagnosis. So in the DSM, there is a diagnostic criteria for autism and a separate diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And as I said, that couples with the NICE guidelines, that makes recommendations of the tools, the assessment measures that we as clinicians, we as teams are meant to use in order to make a diagnosis. But it's a very tricky tightrope to walk when you are also being neuroaffirming, because DSM and NICE guidelines are the opposite of neuroaffirming. So DSM, the criteria for autism and ADHD, is entirely deficits driven. So it is very much about what a child can't do rather than what they can do. So the strengths of their brilliant brains that a neuroaffirming approach will take. So as a clinic myself, you know, I have to walk this line between I have to use DSM and I have to meet NICE guidelines. Otherwise, you know, your diagnosis of autism ADHD is not going to be recognized by schools and the NHS and the local authority at EHCP. So I have to tick the boxes to say that I've used certain measures and I've adhered to the guidelines. But in doing so, it is completely at odds with being neuroaffirming. So, you know, we have to get very creative. And I think we're there in terms of how to be neuroaffirming at the same time. So we have to hold both in our hands. I'm glad I'm saying this to parents, because when I say this to my kids with my hands, the 6-7 comes out, but we're holding two positions in mind. So this is just to very quickly show you the DSM criteria for ADHD. So if any of your children have already got diagnosis of ADHD, this is what would have happened during a diagnostic assessment, is that the clinicians, the team would be looking at the DSM criteria and essentially matching the traits, the behaviors, the symptoms against this criteria. But it's entirely negative. So this one is persistent patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, interfering with function. It has to be pervasive, so that means across context, and has been there for more than 6 months. Also, it's not explained by any other mental disorder difficulty. But look at the criteria. Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention, often doesn't seem to listen, fails to follow instructions, difficulty organizing the task, avoids. I mean, need I go on? I've basically highlighted all the negatives. So you can see it's basically the whole thing. Fidgets, taps hands, leaves since, talks excessively. Gosh, who is to say what's excessive? Blurts out, difficulty waiting turn, blah, blah, blah. Actually, the neuroaffirming approach would really respect, as I said, respect an ADHD neurotype and way of thinking, and focus on the positives. So actually, you know, an ADHD brain can focus beautifully on things that are really interesting to them, and they're incredibly passionate and dedicated to whatever it is they're interested in. That's called hyperfocus, that ability to tunnel vision onto something, often to the expense of other things going on in their lives, but can absolutely deep dive into something that is of interest. So they have got amazing attention for something that's interesting. They essentially have an interest-driven nervous system. You know, they will go for whatever's interesting. They will notice details that other people might miss in those areas of interest. So they are able to pick up on details that are missing. They thrive in engaging and meaningful and hands-on tasks. They have wonderful energy and enthusiasm and drive, like brilliantly so. They enjoy movement, and if they are active, that makes them engaged learners. So movement, learning from when you're standing up or rocking or throwing a ball, they can absolutely take on that information. And they can be really motivating and energizing to other people around them. They're the most creative, brilliantly motivated people. They can be spontaneous without overthinking, and incredibly creative. They take initiative, try new things. And they can think very quickly and respond in the moment. So they can be imaginative and innovative. I mean, some of the most amazing minds in the world, the creations have come from neurodivergent brains. We would be without Apple if we didn't have a neurodivergent brain, we wouldn't have Apple and Microsoft. They think outside the box. They come up with the most amazing ideas. They come at problems differently. They're often very visual in their thinking style, and that means that they can come up with great visual solutions. They can come up with lots of ideas and solutions. They can feel emotions very deeply and very passionately and very quickly. They have a very strong sense of fairness and empathy and justice, and they are the most genuine and honest within relationships. Now move on to autism. This is the diagnostic criteria for autism. So this is the DSM. Again, the opposite of neuroaffirming and neurodiversity affirming here. So we are straight off looking at deficits. So for any of your young people that have already been diagnosed, again, this is the criteria that they would have been matched against. This just does not sit well with me. It's all about deficits. It's all about what they can't do. Deficits in nonverbal communication, poorly integrated nonverbal and verbal communication, deficits in socio-emotional reciprocity, deficits in maintaining and understanding relationships. Who is to say? Restricted and repetitive patterns. I mean, need I go on? This just makes me wince. It's awful for a young person to be compared against this like standard of how they're supposed to be. It completely misaligns with, respecting neurodiversity and seeing all brains as unique and brilliant and different. So reframing the diagnostic criteria here, we have young people who have a preference for sameness, preference for routine, enjoyment of repetition. They have passions and interests that they can, again, deep dive into and brings them utter joy. A monotropic thinking style. Again, this is this tunnel vision and being able to be so dedicated and committed to a line of thinking. Wonderfully dynamic attention. Communication that is a preference for talking for a purpose. Like, what is the point of small talk? Let's all reflect on that. Why do we do it? It's pointless. Preference for info dumping and just completely, sharing their passion for their interest in that real download kind of way. They are completely honest, and sorry that they are clear, but that is meant to be clear and free from sarcasm and any hidden meaning. They will say what's on their mind. They will be judgment free. They'll be the most open-hearted young people. There's a preference for functional relationships. So, there's a reason why we're friends. It might be that we are friends because we go to the park together. We enjoy the same interests. There's a preference for interacting with other neurodivergent young people. Not always, but I certainly see that social anxiety can be somewhat less when a neurodivergent person meets another like-minded person. There is an easier connection in terms of appreciating each other's minds and how they think. Yes, best relationships with others that share interest. Socializing can be draining, but the social battery is something to recognize. And they prefer reduced eye contact. Eye contact's distracting. Why are we so obsessed with making it? Preference for particular movements and repetition and finding these regulating. Over and under reactive sensory input, and once regulated through their sensory domains, things are easier. They may enjoy smelling and touching objects. They might enjoy the stimming, so that regular movement to again facilitate regulation. And alexithymia is differences in communication of emotions. So a preference for perhaps emotions being communicated behaviorally rather than verbally. So let's dive into what makes a good diagnostic assessment, and a neuroaffirming one. And there are many clinics out there, and this isn't me setting up my stall to say this is why you all need to come, to Every Mind, because there's lots of choice out there. It's more that I wanted to support parents to think about what you're after from a diagnostic assessment. And when a clinic says they're neurodiversity affirming or neuroaffirming, because that is a big buzzword out there, it's being mindful as to what that actually means. So, first and foremost, you want clinicians who are actually trained to do these assessments. And believe me, there are many that aren't. So you want to have clinicians who are HCPC registered. You want to have clinicians who have done this before. They're not just fresh into the world of autism and ADHD assessments, that they have had quite a few years in clinical practice and working with neurodivergent people before going into the field, and that they are neuroaffirming as clinicians. And this is living and breathing it. So, it's not a case of a clinician, a psychologist like me, just going off and doing a webinar like this and learning what neuroaffirming practice means or what the neurodiversity movement is. It's about constantly reflecting as a clinician on your own beliefs and expectations around behavior and diagnoses and autism and ADHD, because, we all have our experiences. Things were very different 30, 40 years ago. Obviously, we're a product of our upbringing and experiences and narratives that we've been exposed to. So actually, as a clinic, that they continue to develop as clinicians, reflecting on what neuroaffirming practice means to them. And the other thing that is really important is looking at the clinic, that it has a team of professionals. So whilst ADHD, technically, it could be a single professional. So it could be a pediatrician, psychiatrist, potentially a clinical psychologist making the diagnosis themselves. To be truly neuroaffirming and respectful for the individual, it would need to be a team of professionals, because they bring different perspectives, they bring different types of assessments, they bring different eyes. So certainly for autism assessments, it needs to be a multidisciplinary team. That means different clinicians, psychologists, speech therapists, OT, any mix of those. For ADHD, it can technically be a single clinician, but it certainly needs to be a clinician who has got a lot of training in mental health, because in ADHD, you want to be thinking about other things that could be going on for this young person, and mental health and trauma are big things. A really key one in a neuroaffirming assessment is that autistic voice and experience is absolutely central. So your child is front and center of everything. And that is a commitment right from the start. So the service provider takes the time to prepare you and your young person to go through the process. And that can include videos of the clinic, letters, individualized for your young person. It could be photos of who they're going to see. It could be written questions of what they're going to be asked when they come in. All these things that are respecting that a potentially neurodivergent young person will be coming in feeling really nervous and really anxious about what's coming, given other experience they might have had with service providers and medical settings. So, it's a service that then takes the time to get to know your young person and here's their story. And it is a story. It is their, experiences. It's their beliefs. It is not just, let's just tick off what we have to do in the NICE guidelines. Right, I've done that. Yeah, done the ADOS. I'll go into what that means in a minute. We've done, the interview with the parents. Rush, let's go through it. As much as possible, and I accept there are service constraints around this, that an assessment is taking the time to respect, enjoy, validate your child's experiences and their story. And neuroaffirming assessment, diagnostic assessment, is not one that just ticks your child off against a DSM criteria. It is one that gets to know them. It is one that creates a formulation, like a whole understanding of your young person. So they can say, oh, it's autism or ADHD or both. So what? What does that mean? Tell me more. I need meat on the bones. I need to understand what that means. What are my child's strengths? What are their abilities? What do they thrive in? What environments work best for them? How does their brain process information, etc., etc. And different people, different contexts are involved across different settings. So a neuroaffirming assessment it creates a safe sensory environment for your young person as much as possible, because I appreciate in the NHS this is really challenging because of obviously the environments that exist, but they've taken time to consider what that would look like. So, doing things like a sensory audit, checking the lights don't buzz too much, or they're not flickering, or there's no smells that are too much. I tell all my clinicians, for example, to limit the amount of perfume and aftershave they use, because that can be super overwhelming for a young person when they come into a new space. That it's, that the service is willing to make adaptations around where to meet, like where to do the assessment, when to do the assessment. Maybe there's a better time of day for your young person. Our clinic is above a vet's, and they have certain times of day that they have clinics running. And if I know I've got a young person who is really worried about dogs, then we'll ask, should we move the appointment to another time of day when we know there's not going to be dogs in the car park? It might be that they need adaptations as to having a certain something in the room with them. I've had therapy dogs, for example, come in. Many different toys come in from home. There's no rules and regulations on how to create a safe space for a young person. But if they feel validated for their perspective and their needs and their approaches from the moment they walk into a service, it's going to make for a much more positive experience for them when the assessment is complete. So typically, what does the process of an assessment look like? And this is general for autism and ADHD. So ideally, for it to be neuroaffirming, neuroinclusive, it should start off with an initial consultation. And I'll go into this a little bit in a minute. So you meet the child, find out more about them, etc., etc. That there are questionnaires completed ahead of that initial consultation, not least to get the multiple informants, but also because there might not be stuff that can be captured in that first meeting, and it might give your child more of an opportunity to share their views and their experiences in the absence of being able to do that face to face. There needs to always be, this is the same for autism and ADHD, a parent interview, so a developmental history taking, and that can vary in length depending on what measure that the clinic is using. There should always be a child assessment session. It sounds like logic, like that should happen, but I've heard some horror stories where a child has not been involved in an ADHD assessment, so a diagnosis has been given without even meeting the child, which is just ludicrous to me. So, key is make sure that service is looking in to meet your young person, and ideally over a number of appointments. Either splitting one appointment into smaller appointments, or it might be that they're having different assessments because there might be barriers to your child, being themselves in that first meeting. It might be that there's lots of anxiety, but also, as I said earlier, multiple experiences of hearing the child's story and getting family. Then there should always be a clinical review or a meeting, essentially. So there should be more than one professional making the decision. So there is a consideration of all of the information that is been gleaned through the assessment, and it's the pulling together. So it is essentially paying, looking at the DSM and seeing if they have met diagnostic criteria, but that should also be so what. Then there's a written report, and that report should be written in a particular language that is neuroaffirming and not deficits driven. Again, I'll go into this in a sec. And there should be a feedback session. So this is an opportunity, not least for you to ask questions but also if the young person wants to talk more about what this diagnosis is. So the initial screener or consultation is initial meeting. We do a 1 hour meeting, for example. Lots of clinics do that. It's great, not least because you're meeting that child for the first time. You're giving them the opportunity to see where they might come for the assessment, but you're setting the tone for the assessment as a whole. So I tell kids as soon as they come in, this isn't school. There's no expectations here. If you don't want to make eye contact, absolutely fine. If you want to wiggle around, absolutely fine. If you want to roll on the ground, if you want to play with these toys, if you don't want to answer all of my questions, that's totally fine. And I certainly don't throw lots of questions at a young person when they come in for their first time. I spend time getting to know them, drawing pictures, looking at photographs, playing with whatever toy that they brought in, like really wanting to join them in their world to honour their perspective. It also, that initial meeting, the clinicians can start to introduce the language that will be used throughout. So this is the language that is respecting neurodiversity. So we're looking at strengths, what this child can do, what their abilities, like rephrasing that diagnostic criteria for the strengths focused language. So seeing the brain as different rather than disordered, and using that language from the get-go so the child's familiar. Also in that initial meeting, you're discussing preferences for assessment, so communication preferences. Child prefer to use images rather than talking, with pictures and do drawing and stuff like that. Would they like to come at a particular time of day, as I said, or something crime would like altered or changed in any way? And as I said, it's questionnaire then to capture the voice. It also is, the initial screener is thinking with the family as a whole, is this the right option? Is this the right time to go for a neurodiversity assessment? Or should we be considering another path? It's certainly not the case that, a child comes in for a screener and you'll always say, yes, let's do a full assessment. It might be, actually, there's other things going on that either need to be addressed first, or maybe it's not neurodiversity at all. So it's a great opportunity for having all of those conversations and explaining more about the assessment process if needed. So that is the first thing that should happen in neuroaffirming. So in an autism assessment, for those of you that have had it or their child has had it, we have to use something called the ADOS, right? So this isn't a nice guideline. It means it's one of these things we have to tick. I absolutely hate it. It's the worst thing ever. For those of you that have seen it or heard of it, it's a semi-structured observation of social communication. So essentially, it is having a conversation with a young person. It's a speech therapist that does it. So, but it's very contrived, and there are tasks that have to be done, like reading a story from a book based on pictures. There's no words, making up a story from like random objects and stuff like that. And it's meant to be an observation of differences associated with autism. But it's not very good. It's not very good for our masking girls or our masking boys, because it's only an hour long and they can essentially hold it together for all of that time. It's not very good for older people, certainly not good for adults. It's quite invalidating and also quite traumatizing for many adults. It's a shame that it's still in the diagnostic criteria. But, we do try and prepare our young people for the fact that it's not a great assessment. And certainly in the report, we would not write it up using the deficit language that the ADOS want us to. So it's sort of undoing a bit of the rubbishness that comes from ADOS. But it's universal. So in the UK, pretty much every service uses it. There is another one called the MIGDAS, if anybody's heard of it. Very few services use it because obviously, certainly for us in the private sector, there's a risk if we do use it. Other services would say we have not met NICE guidelines, so this assessment is something. Although it's not a core component component of a child assessment. A cognitive assessment would be very neuroaffirming and very helpful to add into a diagnostic assessment. A cognitive assessment is essentially helping to understand more about how your child's brain works, so how they process information, their working memory, verbal skills, problem-solving skills, sort of global cognitive. And it's super, super helpful for helping us to understand more about the brain. There isn't a particular profile associated with autism and ADHD, but we do tend to see people can have a slower processing speed, so it can take them longer to take in information, particularly if it's verbal. And ADHD young people can struggle with working memories. That's holding lots of information in mind and using it. And that kind of makes sense. It's not diagnostic, it's just very, very helpful in helping a young person. In terms of ADHD for a child assessment, a good assessment would be using something like the DIVA. So this is DIVA. Basically, it's sort of an interview for ADHD, but it's done not just with parents, you do it with a child as well. And that isn't typically done, I would say. We do it in all, but it means that we're capturing the story of the young person and the experiences that they have, not just what parents report. Particularly for ADHD girls, it's really helpful because they can be like amazing maskers. So even parents don't necessarily appreciate what they're dealing with in terms of QB check. It's not the most neuroaffirming. I've just put it on there because we have to do it a bit like the ADAS. This is a test. It's not universal, but it is again quite interesting in terms of helping a young person to understand the brain. It's something that's recommended in the news. I am going to speed up. I'm so sorry. Parent interview. There's lots of different measures out there. Obviously, we just want to make sure that the team does a history with the parent. We use something called DISCO. This is a sort of a massive assessment. It's about 5 hours long for autism. It's really comprehensive. It picks up on things like PDA. It picks up on masking. It picks up on so many other things going on in a young person's life. But there are other tools, so like ADIR, 3DI, they exist in the NHS. I guess the important thing is that, the service is allowing parents the space to talk about their experiences and their views and validating them rather than it being a rush. ADHD parents would also do an interview, and that's called a DIVA. Again, it could be a slightly adapted developmental history. It depends on the service. ADHD, it's important to consider medical history. It is still a very medicalized diagnosis, unfortunately, but that's because there is medication for ADHD. So a good provider does need to consider medical history and mental health considerations, because as I said earlier, to assess for things like trauma, anxiety, depression, because a lot of those symptoms look very similar to ADHD. So you need a mental health professional to be able to pull that apart. And trained in mental health. This one is brilliant. School observation. Not loads of clinics do it. We do it. It's brilliant on the neuroaffirming side because you're not just relying on filling in a question. You're actually going to people on the ground and you get so much experience, but also assess the environment so you can see it for yourself. You can see if the lights are flickering. You can also have a discussion with teachers. So it's then creating a relationship with teachers. You're starting to kind of sow the seeds of potential neurodiversity and seeing it through those eyes, rather than it being a doom approach. Masking when you do a school observation, or you can see some subtleties that might be associated with it. I've seen girls in school, for example, who are a total swan from the desk up, and then under the table you see their legs. and it paints it down. The teacher wouldn't necessarily pick up on that because they've got other, other they're seeing. So us being able to go in and observe a child, or at the very least have an interview with a teacher and get more information, it just adds more to that understanding of the child as a whole, rather than the tick, yes, no, autism. Then, we want the team to come together and make a diagnostic decision as a team. No one clinician would hold the weight, so no one assessment in diagnostic assessment would be the thing that gives the diagnosis. We've got multiple perspectives to formulate one story, one understanding, and then that creates personal and meaningful. So it's keeping your child key and central to absolutely everything. And as I mentioned earlier, there's always a report, and that is the place where I think the change in focus from deficits to strength and difference can really happen. So yes, you have to, as a clinician, say how, so you do have to tick those boxes. But you can name the fact that you do that and then rewrite it with that alternative criteria. So, okay, yes, they are, a child is struggling with changes in routine, but that's because they have a preference for routine. They appreciate routine and they appreciate doing things easy. So you can change the language. I'm very mindful that any report that I write, even if it's for a 6-year-old, could be read by them when they're 18. So I want to be sure that the language that experience and neurotype, that when they're 18, they don't, what's wrong with me? Like, this is awful. My brain is broken. It can be really traumatizing. So it's walking the tightrope with DSM criteria, NICE guidelines also being, and that filtering through. We don't, a neuroaffirming report will not use the term ASD. And we wouldn't say low functioning or high functioning, because that is a concept that's been defined by the medical model. It is not a concept that's neuroaffirming in any way. Who am I to say if someone is high or low? And then, as I said, a feedback session. So this is an opportunity, and it should be part of the diagnosis. It should be an opportunity for you as parents to go back about what does it mean like this. And it helps parents to make sense of it. Steps, for school, what does it mean for relationships, what does it like, and just allowing parents to be able to verbalize that, to feel that. Young people will often come to those feedback sessions, and it's a lovely opportunity to talk about the brain difference and their strengths, as well as acknowledging the needs. Like, this is not, neuroaffirming is not saying you don't have any needs at all, like, forget it. It absolutely respects that there's difficulties. It's needs there. But it's acknowledging that there's a balance of strengths associated with neurodiversity. It's a brilliant brain, that it's incredibly helpful in giving us things. So I'll do like an all about me, which strengths. So it's beginning that journey of this. Right, I'm going to just